By 1650, all known Christian people had been exiled or executed under the forces of an edict put forward by Tokugawa Hidetada and Tokugawa Iemitsu. These two men were the kin of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who succeeded him. You may recall Tokugawa Ieyasu's friendship with the Englishman William Adams, known formerly in Japan as Ōmura Domain. The perceived necessity for such a slaughter and exile was brought to the forefront of societal consciousness by the incident at Shimabara, often referred to as the Amakusa Uprising. The uprising cost the lives of 37,000 Christians and people with allegiance to Christians. The figure of 37,000 is referenced on EBSCO.com. Some of these noble Christians were publicly executed and some were thrown into a volcano. Can you imagine the trek up the volcano, knowing you are being dragged by angry samurai from another island up the volcano to meet your maker? Amakusa Shiro's head, the leader of the revolt, was taken to Nagasaki City as a showpiece. The Christians were outnumbered, yet reinforced by a small elite force of Ronin and some Portuguese and Spanish forces. The Catholic interest was a source of the support of the Dutch for the prevailing powers of Tokugawa shogunate. Despite the shogunate's overwhelming forces of over 100,000 men, the fight for Christendom in Japan lasted a significant amount of time. It is reminiscent of the Wall of Jericho in a certain sense, although the rebellion began due to a myriad of reasons, including taxation and corruption. They battled valiantly to preserve their centuries-old Christian identities. The corruption, and as we shall see later in the discussion, the volatile nature of the Warring States era had led to many people with true faith and many who advocated the freedom to have faith in Christ. This was a valiant last stand, incidentally one of the last rebellions in the Tokugawa era, which lasted almost 300 years. There was a conflict in Hokkaido that revolved around the plight for the Ainu recognition too. So, how did it get to such an extreme situation wherein some 37,000 men, women and children were martyred? The context lies with the ever-expanding global powers of Spain and Portugal, and the Vatican spearheading an expansion of Christendom, using those then superpowers as a vehicle for the salvation of Christ to reach the world. The conflict was therein exacerbated by the Dutch relations with Japan, in the sense that they were at war in Europe and wanted to quash interests overseas, and spoke openly about the corruption and displacements of loyalty among the various nation folk of Europe unto the Pope. Under the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, a line was drawn down the Atlantic. Portugal took everything to the east, and Spain took everything to the west, with the exception, of course, of Brazil. By 1521, the Portuguese had conquered through India, up into Malacca, and further into the Philippines. According to John Dougill, it seemed a matter of time before they reached Japan. Nevertheless, their arrival on a small island near Kyushu, known as Tanegashima, was by complete accident. They were on a Chinese junker, Their ship suffered an incredible storm, which set them off course while travelling to China. When they arrived on the island, they had no knowledge of Japan or the language. However, they were able to have some level of communication due to the Chinese language being fundamental to the written language of Japan, i.e. kanji. And so the first communication the Japanese had with Europeans was writing Chinese characters in the sand on a shipwrecked beach. Curiosity regarding the firearms led to a demonstration wherein a marksman shot a target from over 100 yards. The renowned phrase is, "This shot was heard all over Japan." And the exchange of this technology was wed to the firm teachings of Christ. And pertinently, the interest in early modern tech/weaponry would carry Christian thoughts and ideas into the consciousness of many feudal lords. Japan was at this time unsettled and not united. There was significant chaos among the warlords vying for control. This chaos would continue for some time. Therein, weaponry arguably played a key role in rolling out Christendom in Japan. The feudal lords were attracted by the tech and weaponry they could obtain by entertaining the Jesuits. However, it is noted by historians, and is a common consensus, that the laymen in those days were attracted by the philosophy and religious tenets during a time when mortality was at the forefront of the mind. And so, one could say, Christianity too began with a bang. The realization of the immense power of the weapon on the island of Tanegashima inspired the local feudal lord to begin replicating the weapons he received. Luckily, the island was awash with a plethora of skilled blacksmiths due to the geology of the area and the necessity for swords in a turbulent era. In fact, still to this day, the Tanegashima scissors and kitchen knives are a household name. After 4 months, the design was perfected to a degree in which the feudal lord felt ready to pounce on the neighbouring island's feudal lord. Incidentally, the first marriage between a European and a Japanese woman was said to be of a blacksmith's daughter and a Portuguese sailor. Her name was Wakasa, and there are various versions of her story, each varying in degrees of romance, grief, and poignancy. So, the tale of Christianity arriving in Japan is one of guns, romance, technological ingenuity, and conquest. The gunshot that was heard all across Japan would echo through the following years until firearms became somewhat of a taboo culturally, and the era of aforementioned peace began with the Tokugawa regime some centuries later. Francis Xavier, a man born in the north of Spain, became a renowned figure in the birth of Christianity in Japan. On August 15th, 1549, he sailed to Japan on a Portuguese ship. He had become well acquainted with a Japanese man known as Anjiro during their time in Malacca. Their acquaintance fostered a belief within Xavier that the Japanese were sophisticated and open to theology. And so they set sail together for Kagoshima. Quickly, Xavier noticed that the methods he had used for the message of Christ in other regions of the world were not suitable for the sophisticated nature of Japanese culture. The notions of poverty and the struggle of the commoner were not as astute in projecting the voice of the good news. Japan, despite being in an era of long unrest and civil war, was still well structured and hierarchical. Nevertheless, he achieved an amazing feat of bringing at least 2,000 people to Christ in Japan. He was adamant that a route to consolidating the development of Christendom in Japan lay in China. For millennia, Japan looked to China for wisdom. For example, the integration of kanji, i.e. Chinese characters. The elites from the Heian era onwards systematically selected Chinese philosophies such as Buddhism, Confucianism, etc. as their hallmarks and validations for rule. Despite there being no conquest of Japan by China, nor successful ones by the Mongol Empire. Francis Xavier died on an island off the coast of China before he could realize his vision of leveraging China's unique position in the consciousness of the Japanese. He died while he was waiting for access to the Chinese mainland to begin his vision of uniting Christendom in Asia. His remains were taken to Goa in India. His remains are still there to this day, and people sometimes pay tribute to his relics. Irregardless of his misfortune and untimely death, Francis Xavier laid the foundations and paved the way for future missionary works. He fostered a wisdom in the coming missionaries that would allow them to adapt their praxis of extolling the message of Christ to the needs of the Japanese culture. He was the catalyst in the adaptation and development of methods used to help promote the beauty of Christianity to the people he famously called the best people yet discovered. A little more context is needed before we delve deep into the dynamics of Christianity's success in Japan. 100 years prior to the arrival of Xavier in Japan, there was what is known as the Onin War from 1467 to 1477. The Onin War was a result of the dispute of who should succeed Ashika Yoshimasa as the shogun. It resulted in Kyushu, the southernmost main island of Japan, being fractured into many warring fiefdoms, and it is held to be what started the Sengoku Jidai by many historians. The Sengoku Jidai, known to the West as the Warring States period, was an era that ushered in a volatile and dangerous environment in Japan, as various feudal lords vied for the power. It brought about various notorious historical figures such as Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. The poignant times of chaos, despite the civilized nature of society, led to a time wherein mortality, eternity, and morality were prevalent in the societal consciousness. These factors created a very unique environment for the missionaries from Rome. Furthermore, the caste system and traditional master-servant relationships between lords and vassals were increasingly questioned. Pertinently, Christianity taught against the caste system, as in Galatians 3:28 NIV. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Ōmura Sumitada was born in 1533. He was adopted at the age of 5 by his uncle. This was a common practice in the samurai era. Sometimes it was to secure an heir for succession. Sometimes it was to secure peace between feudal lords. In this case, it was largely to secure an heir for the Ōmura clan, as he was the son of Ōmura Sumiyoshi, the Ōmura lord's sister. He was an ideal candidate for the succession. So, he was taken from Arima Harazumi, the lord of Shimabara, by Ōmura Sumisaki. Time went on. Not much is known about his early life. We do know he succeeded his uncle in 1550 and became the ruler of the Ōmura Domain. Ōmura Sumitada inherited a domain that was relatively weak and faced pressures from all sides of its borders. Historical figures such as the infamous Ryozoji Takanobu, Goto Takaki, Saigo Sumitaka, and even Toyotomi Hideyoshi himself all played key roles in threatening his domain during his premiership. Ōmura Sumitada was pertinent to this local history discussion. The first Christian daimyo. His relationship with the Jesuits played a key role in the formation of Christendom in Japan, and his life choices led to a chain of events that resulted in there being a population of Christians brave enough to make their last stand at the aforementioned Amakusa uprising. His relationship with the Jesuits was indeed a close one. His initial intentions are largely unknown. Perhaps he had heard the metaphorical bang of the gunshot on Tanegashima, or perhaps he had an inclination to the exoticism of the Christians and a predisposition to faith. Or perhaps it was the perfect blend of those factors. The fact remains that he became Dom Bartholomew, 1563, the first Christian daimyo, and upon and from his christening, he took his faith very seriously, and is said to have had zeal and righteousness according to the Vatican records. He famously sliced the head of a local statue at a temple and razed the temple to the ground. His unwavering support for the Jesuits was rewarded many times by the Portuguese and Spanish empires. These factors led to Toyotomi Hideyoshi disliking him and would set more issues ahead for Ōmura Sumitada's heirs, one of which continued with a Christian identity and another that refused the identity. In 1561, there was an attack on the port of Hirado. which was the safe haven for foreigners in Japan. The Lord of Hirado was not fond of Jesuits, and this, in combination with the dispute over the price of trade, led to 14 people being murdered, which resulted in Hirado no longer being the safe haven until the end of the Sengoku Jidai, when Tokugawa Ieyasu gave permission to the foreign traders for the use of Hirado in 1609, which led to Hirado being in use until the switch to the renowned Dejima during the period of isolationism, i.e. Sakoku, the locked nation. In 1562, recognizing the benefits of trade with foreign powers, Ōmura Sumitada gave the port of Yokosuka to the foreign powers of Portugal, and to a lesser extent Spain. The Jesuits praised this action intensely. However, in the same year, Goto Takaki attacked the port and left it in ruins, which led to a chain of events that resulted in Ōmura Sumitada having to flee the castle of Aonogi, a castle in close proximity to the port in question, within Ōmura's domain. In the same year, 1562, he had also given the Jesuits complete freedom to preach within his domain. The Portuguese rewarded Ōmura with military support at various points regarding this incursion and threat. Ōmura eventually restored dominion of his domain, temporarily that is. In 1563, Ōmura Sumitada was baptized. This was much to the delight of the Vatican, and is a pillar in the sainthood of Xavier, as Xavier's legacy of bringing Christendom to Japan truly began to take hold. Notably, in the transitional years that came, he also faced a massive threat from a samurai known as Sengoku Sumitada. Sengoku Sumitada led a coalition of all the enemies of Ōmura in 1572. However, in 1574, the Portuguese, knowing the importance of Ōmura Sumitada both for trade and his position as a catalyst for faith, retaliated on Ōmura Sumitada's behalf. They did so with unprecedented levels of military support, which shocked the Japanese bakufu as they began to realize the significant power the Portuguese Empire held, and created a firm stance for Ōmura Sumitada to use as a platform for his continued mission of spreading the gospel. Ergo, in 1574, Ōmura Sumitada submitted to the pressures from the Jesuits to condone idol worship. These pressures came from the rising figures such as Gaspar Coelho, who saw a new path for the route of conversion of Japan, comparatively to the methods of Xavier. 60,000 people were coerced into conversion, i.e. forcibly converted. Obviously, some of those people accepted the gospel with great willingness and interest. Numerous temples were destroyed throughout his domain, and he himself, on the way to a skirmish to protect his domain, famously sliced a statue and razed the holy site to the ground as aforementioned. It is noted that he proclaimed, "How many times have you forsaken me?" indicating his significant predisposition beyond the temporal and his confidence in his new learnings and faith. Some notes about Gaspar Coelho, a Jesuit. he catalyzed hatred from Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He served the Vatican in Japan for a considerable amount of time and even ascended to the chief role in Japan in 1581. Gaspar Koho garnered the hatred of Toyotomi Hideyoshi and many others due to his policy of eradicating the local religions and his brutal enforcement of that. Gaspar Koho, it can be arguably said, chose unchristian methods to promote Christianity. He was arguably belligerent and egotistical. He revoked the previous methods of garnering support and using the weight of the gospel in discussions, etc., in favor of coercion. In fear of Ryozoji Takanobu, on June 9th, 1580, Ōmura Sumitada ceded the Nagasaki port to the Jesuits. He did this due to the growing power of Ryozoji Takanobu and the threat that he there imposed to Ōmura Sumitada's domain. In fact, there had already been 2 dramatic incursions into Ōmura Sumitada's domain by Ryozoji Takanobu's forces in the years 1577 and 1578. Ōmura Sumitada was fearful of the growing dominance of his rival and needed the support of the Portuguese. For some reason, the same year, he ceded the port to the Jesuits. He went to Saga and requested to become Ryozoji Takanobu's subordinate in exchange for retaining some rulership in his domain. Ryozoji Takanobu was reluctant to tackle the Jesuits at Nagasaki, perhaps because he knew they had significant potential to cause havoc with their technologies of war. So, as he was unaware of the scale of backlash, he left them to continue in Nagasaki. At this point, Ryozoji Takanobu was the most powerful samurai daimyo in the whole of the island of Kyushu, and was ostensibly expanding his domain with the goal of unifying the island and potentially Japan. He was a fierce samurai daimyo with grit and aspirations for his domain. Ōmura Sumitada was summoned to the Battle of Okitanawate. However, Ōmura was slow to mobilize his forces and didn't arrive in time. In fact, this was in part due to the incredible turn of events and skirmish that extinguished the life of Ryozoji Takanobu and left his forces in chaos. The forces of Arima were not willing to capitulate to Ryozoji Takanobu. The Battle of Okitanawate took place on the coastline. The Arima gunboats blasted through the front of the front line of Ryozoji Takanobu's forces. Immediately after that, a band of elite samurai warriors, highly skilled and highly trained in swordsmanship that would strike fear into the heart of a yokai, charged up through the line and slew everyone in their path at lightning speed, gaining such momentum through the lines of the army that it is said that Ryozoji Takanobu himself wondered if his own army was revolting, according to some accounts. In a matter of moments, a fierce samurai sliced off Ryozoji Takanobu's head. The most powerful daimyo died in a dramatic fashion at the hands of quite possibly the most talented samurai warriors on this island. This decisive battle was near Shimabara, on the coastline. The Battle of Okitanawate created a sudden shift in the power balance as the once great daimyo perished. His troops lost all morale, as, with him, his dream of creating unified Kyushu from his powerhouse in Saga perished with him. This shift in the power balance in Kyushu left a vacuum for Toyotomi Hideyoshi to fill with his military might and his morale-boosting and empowering underdog story. Toyotomi Hideyoshi rallied forces from the main island, and the whole of Japan stood still in awe. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, for those unaware, is a name of great significance and notoriety in Japan, even to this day. Arguably, he was remarkable. Arguably, he has a remarkable status in human history. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was from a low foot soldier caste. He was essentially a peasant, permitted to use swords. He drove up the ranks of Oda Nobunaga's army and became a key figure in ending the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai, i.e. the Warring States era. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi arrived, Ōmura Sumitada almost immediately bowed down to his prevailing might of both forces and status. Pertinent to this discussion, Toyotomi Hideyoshi was a powerful samurai who hated the Jesuits. It is noted by some Christians he had hatred for Gaspar Correia, as previously mentioned. This was in stark contrast to Oda Nobunaga, who had found foreign cultures and people to be an intriguing and even beneficial elements for consolidating his power. Notably, Oda Nobunaga allowed the Jesuits to build a church in Kyoto, the then capital. Oda Nobunaga even had a close dialogue with many of the Jesuits, such as Alessandro Balignano, for whom he emancipated a slave known as Yasuke. A man who served Nobunaga right until the end of Oda Nobunaga's life, freely and with pride. It is noted Nobunaga had a plurality about religion and sought to disembowel the hegemony of the Buddhists in Japan. He essentially was very open-minded and sought only to unify Japan with his grand vision of peace by any means, and killed indiscriminately anyone who obscured the path to peace. Yasuke was fighting at the door of Honnoji Temple in order to give Nobunaga the time he needed to commit seppuku, so Nobunaga could have an honourable death, as the scoundrel who was seeking his death was indeed on all accounts without any dignity. Yasuke's whereabouts after being taken in by the rival of Nobunaga remained a mystery. He was resold into slavery, executed, or did he go into hiding? Did he avenge Nobunaga? Who knows? I like to think he kicked ass and fled to a remote island for safekeeping. He lived out his days drinking sake and working the rice farms with a beautiful family, rather than facing the humiliating life of bondage once more. Incidentally, this is the theme for an upcoming alternate history JRPG I'm working on in my free time. Check it out. Anyway. Foremost, Ōmura Sumitada would have been aware of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's aversion to foreign influence and his viral disdain towards Jesuits. Additionally, Toyotomi was cooking up some policies to eradicate Christendom, which came into force swiftly. Therein being a man who had personally raised temples, damned the old ways, and forcibly coerced people into conversion, He must have been inclined to accept every demand from Toyotomi Hideyoshi in fear of incomprehensible reprisals. Even though Ōmura had tactically maneuvered himself politically and militarily through decades of pressures from all sides, he perished very soon after meeting Hideyoshi. Ōmura Sumitada had been a force for the gospel. Whether his heart lay with his domain and he found Christ along the way, we cannot be entirely sure. Nevertheless, it seems he indeed had some kind of Damascene moment after his baptism, as he became so zealous in his cause for Christ, as well as being loyal to his people's security and the legacy of his family's domain. He had shifted the balance in the religious and philosophical consciousness of Japan. He was the hallmark as the first Christian daimyo. He set a chain of events off that led to one of the most remarkable tales of Christianity in the world, i.e. the Shimabara uprising and the hidden Christians. Toyotomi Hideyoshi resented the policies of the Jesuits contemporary to the time, as he resented anything that caused destruction. He revoked the past in order to build the future, and it certainly has to be said that the methods of the Jesuits became more destructive and less Christian under Gaspar Coelho, as he led his missionaries with the ideals of destruction, not discussion. These methods are a far cry from how the story began with Xavier. As mentioned, Ōmura Sumitada died within a year of Toyotomi Hideyoshi filling the power vacuum. The end of the Sengoku Jidai was in sight. The Japanese people could arguably sense they were on the cusp of peace once more. Ōmura Sumitada's son, who had been baptized as a child, Ōmura Yoshiaki and/or Dom Sancho, became the new leader of the domain as a subordinate of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Ōmura Yoshiaki retained his Christian identity through his life. He joined a short-lived campaign into Korea. The campaign was in part a ploy to unify the various samurai daimyo through war and conquest under Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Another underlined issue that rarely is noted is that Toyotomi Hideyoshi was aware of the volatility of the Kyushu power balance due to the lucrative trade and workings with Korea. That is, Korean trade and other such exchanges led to sudden jumps in affluence that in turn facilitated war in Japan, as the money was spent on weaponry and samurai. Ultimately, Toyotomi Hideyoshi's campaign in Korea was disastrous. It essentially led to Toyotomi Hideyoshi's death and the Battle of Sekigahara, and can be said to be even one of the key factors that informed Tokugawa Ieyasu to lock the borders sometimes later. Ōmura Yoshiaki served in the expansion into Korea and returned alive. Ōmura Yoshiaki was tactful and decided to remain neutral during the renowned Battle of Sekigahara, when Tokugawa Ieyasu surfaced as the victor from the chaos of one of the bloodiest battles in human history. He forced Ōmura Yoshiaki to stand down, and his son Ōmura Suminobu succeeded him. The significance of the Battle of Sekigahara is that it was instrumental in consolidating the vision of a unified Japan. The three birds, as one Buddhist scholar notes, had embarked on a life's mission to unify Japan and restore peace, and this battle is largely held to be the beginning of the end of the Sengoku Jidai. There is a famous saying in Japan that gives clarity to the three most prominent samurai leaders of the time. Nobunaga: if a bird doesn't sing, kill it. Hideyoshi: if a bird doesn't sing, make it. Tokugawa: if a bird doesn't sing, wait for it. This is a cultural perspective and not an actual quote, but it epitomizes their personality types in the consciousness of their contemporaries, and indeed in Japan today among scholars and the average Joe alike. The interesting fact is that the battle saw the overlap of traditional samurai battle tactics in combination with modern weaponry. It resulted in one of the three birds taking Japan into over 250 years of peace and stability, i.e. Tokugawa Ieyasu. Little is known about Ōmura Sumitada. Ōmura Sumitada did not participate in the rebellion in Shimabara, the last stand of Christendom. Ōmura Sumitada, beyond the fact that it did not embrace Christianity, is relatively unknown to me. I need to study more. Anyway, the rebellion in Shimabara is sometimes known as the Amakusa Uprising. Amakusa Shiro was a young Christian samurai ronin. The Amakusa revolt, as mentioned at the start of this discussion, cost the lives of 37,000 people. 37,000 people were martyred. Despite being outnumbered by a 100,000 strong army and the Dutch forces, they, the men, women, and children, lasted 5 months in their stronghold, according to the history institution Britannica. If it weren't for the Dutch blowing a hole in the castle wall, who knows what might have happened to the political landscape of Japan? Who knows if those dispossessed Ronin and Christians may have established Kyushu as its own sovereign Christian nation? What ramifications would that have meant for the similar revolt in Hokkaido, wherein the Ainu vied for sovereignty? Would the long-lasting period of peace under the Tokugawa regime have lasted so long into Japan's history? Would the hidden Christians forced into hiding instead have forged a new path for Japan? The final comments are that hidden Christians remained underground for centuries until around the time the Bakufu was dismantled and power was returned to the emperor. During that time, a cathedral was erected, and people and communities of hidden Christians began to surface. For many generations, they had protected the faith that their ancestors had taught them. Some became Catholics immediately, while others had adopted a new form of Christianity that melded Buddhist and Shinto practices with the overarching Christ in perfect synchronicity. Can you imagine the day when a family and underground communities were once more able to proclaim their faith in the good news without the fear of certain death? Can you imagine the candlelit prayers when families embraced in remembrance each year for the 37,000 Shimabara Christians that were massacred? And finally, can you imagine the joy therein when they felt the light of the day as they smiled into the sky as the military rule of samurai, the caste system, and the feudal era ended? Thanks for listening, folks. like and subscribe.